So now you're doing a Q&A with two people who had nothing to do with the film. You just saw it for the first time tonight.
I just
Yes.
saw it for the first time. Yes.
Yes.
But you are a Tolkien scholar and expert, so you're bringing that considerable expertise to this discussion. And I'm just a fan.
However, you know, the chain of inspiration is something that we'll get to eventually, Mr. Martin. But allow me to just quickly introduce myself. My name is Cliff Broadway, from the fan website that has been active for over 20 years, theonering.net. Thank you. Thank you. We have been an all-volunteer pro-literacy website for 20 years, and we have always driven our conversation towards readership, towards expanding the readership of Tolkien. And it was quite interesting to read an editorial from our guy, the head of theonering.net, who is not with us. He's in Pennsylvania, and he had been feeling very disenfranchised, or he called it feeling disconnected from Tolkien fandom for many years, ironic though it may be. And then he said after seeing this film, he felt quite intellectually and spiritually reinvigorated to do something he had not done in many years. Pick up Tolkien and read again.
I'm actually, my area of expertise as a scholar is visual and literary culture. And for me, so not specifically Tolkien, I'm a student of Tolkien. And I say that because there's so much in his work that I don't know that I'll ever fully grasp the depth and the complexity of what he brings to the page, what he brings to the human imagination, and what he has given us as a legacy in literature. What I will say about this film, though, is that as someone who deeply appreciates, loves, and studies Tolkien's work, it captures the power of not only his imagination, but his inspiration to those who follow his work. So watching, you say it caused you a great deal of emotional currents. You had a lot of emotional current. But what that is, for me, watching it as a cinema scholar, is the power of the story. Not only the stories that he created, but the story that he lived. And one of the other things that today I was at a graduation, and one of the points that came up during the graduation, I gave a commencement speech for a department, and we were talking about the power of narrative, the strength and power and potency of narrative, and the ability of stories to connect us as human beings. And people were talking about tragedy. Well, you know, people sort of stood up and at one point and gave their testimonies, and they were talking about tragedy. And I said, you know, the beauty of the pain that we come through as human beings is that it forms us and makes us complete. And that doesn't have to be pain, as this story was able to convey, I think, doesn't have to be the place of our breaking. It can be the place of our birth, right?
Yes.
Our healing also. So that is what I think this story offers us. And I think that we see through this story how Tolkien was able to translate those experiences in a way that made them open and universal and beautiful and powerful and places of connection for other people.
Indeed, indeed. The story of a penniless orphan, a young man who had to grow up fast, facing a life of great uncertainty, with the loss of his mother, with nowhere to go, with no prospects. And the signals that are in this film constantly of young Ronald Tolkien wondering, how can I get somewhere? How can I take care of this beautiful young woman in the future? I can't even take her to the opera. You know, these are common things that a lot of Ringer fans might not even realize that Professor Tolkien felt and those pressures of everyday life as much as we all do. And yet he faced more loss, more personal loss in 1 year, in 1916, than many other people could face in a lifetime, perhaps. Do you find it strange, or perhaps interesting, that the filmmaker chose to focus on just the first half of Tolkien's life, instead of going into his second half of his life, with all of his publishing efforts and all the struggles to get the Silmarillion complete? That's the sequel. Yes, yes. But what do you think of the?
No,
Mays
actually,
approach?
I don't find it strange at all, because biographies of writers are notoriously dull. We don't lead very exciting lives. Whatever internal struggles are going on, externally, we're sitting there these days at a computer, staring at a computer. In the old days, hammering on a typewriter, or as you see Tolkien here, writing with a fountain pen. And that's a pretty dull thing for a viewer to watch. And, you know, how do they dramatize struggle? It's the usual, you know, they see the writer typing, and then he rips out the page and crumbles it up and throws it in the wastebasket, and you see the wastebasket filling up with stuff, and that's supposed to be the dramatization of the struggle.
Yeah.
And particularly seeing him write and rewrite and start and restart the Silmarillion over and over again for, you know, from World War I until his death in 1977, must have been a great trial for him, but would make pretty dull cinema.
Yeah, I hear you on that. Yeah, I read Humphrey Carpenter's biography when I was 21, and I thought it was okay, but it was kind of pedestrian. I had no idea this film would have such emotion and such color and vitality, because I thought it was a rather, you know, academic life that he lived, but there's so much more going on.
Well, you talked about loss and, you know, the loss of his friends in this, and World War I. And, you know, Tolkien actually always resisted the idea that World War I had any influence on Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion. And he adamantly, of course, resisted any idea that he was writing about World War II, you know, and that Sauron was Hitler and all that. That pissed him off. But particularly under World War I think a writer is not always aware of things that's shaping them, and you can see it, you know. We don't, in this country, in the United States, World War I doesn't get much attention. You know, it's, when we look back, it's all World War II. It's all Hitler and the Japanese and Pearl Harbor, and certainly World War II was full of drama. But for an Englishman or for a European, World War I was a shattering, cataclysmic event. World War II, in some ways, was the sequel. But World War I destroyed a civilization. The civilization, the customs, the European way of life that existed before World War I never recovered. An entire generation was wiped out in England. You can still see the monuments to the dead in every English town. The World War I monuments with name after name on them. You know, we have our Vietnam Memorial with a bunch of names that you can go to. We have one. There are hundreds of these World War I memorials all over England, in every town, in every village. Its effects were devastating, and Tolkien was not the only writer to notice it. I mean, you can read in poems like Dover Beach, The Receding Tide, in Yeats, The Second Coming. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. It was a collapse of a civilization and a culture and a way of looking at the world. And what do you find when you look at Tolkien? I mean, the world of Lord of the Rings is a world of loss. There are runes everywhere. There's the ruined monuments like Weathertop and the great statues on the river, ruined cities, of which Minas Tirith and Minas Morgul are just the outpost. There was a gigantic city in between them, which is all gone now. Numenor fallen, the kingdoms of the elves fallen. Everything is fallen, everything is lost, everything is in the past. That's the legacy of World War I, whether Tolkien really realized it or not. This is a world that's seen better days, and
Indeed.
people are playing in the rooms.
In Tolkien's own words, from a letter he wrote to his publisher, letter number 131, quote, "I dislike allegory, the conscious and intentional allegory, and yet any attempt to explain the purport of myth or fairy tale must use allegorical language." Anyway, all this stuff, talking about his mythology, is mainly concerned with the fall, capital F, mortality, capital M, and the machine, capital M.
War.
Indeed, indeed. I find that a fascinating insight.
The the interesting thing to me about the evocative, emotionally evocative nature of this movie, and how war resonates in Tolkien's writing, despite his denial of its influence, right? The inference, emotional inference of it on his work, is that there is also, if you're talking specifically about England and English literature, I find it fascinating that Americans, we've sort of inherited the British literary legacy, right? Many of them. And we take them in some ways for granted, but there are particular workings in Tolkien's work around how we cope, or how British folks cope with grief, with loss, with pain, with emotion in general. That whole stiff upper lip thing is not, it's not a joke.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't come out in the emotionality of your daily life, if you are not, you know, one of the elements within this narrative of the film, and also within Tolkien's work, is this concept of the quest, going forward despite all, continuing forward, continuing on, soldiering on. You don't feel the emotion, you move on. And in this particular case, or in the particular case of Tolkien's work, when I read it, I think this is about the sort of expiation, or processing, or negotiating of this space, emotional space in his life that he had to deal with, and he found a productive vehicle through which to negotiate it. And I think that also translates onto the film, for me. If they use the source material of his life, this is what, you know, I think the director quite successfully captured and conveys within the film.
Mm. Yes. The young man, Gilson, who was the son of the headmaster of King Edward's School, he died in active gunfire at the Battle of the Somme on his very first day. On his very first day in active duty at the trenches. And there's something worth reading here. I don't want to take too much time, but there's a response from a 21-year-old Ronald Tolkien writing, and I'll only read a couple of sentences. And this is written right after the death of Gilson. And this is a letter in response, because it was Geoffrey Smith, who is the friend he was looking for in the battlefield in this film. And Geoffrey Smith made Ronald Tolkien aware of the death of their friend. And he says here, in response to his own grief, he says, "I really feel what Rob also really felt. Friendship to the nth power." He says, "So far, my chief impression is that something has gone crack. I'm hungry and I'm lonely, of course, but I don't feel a member of a little complete body now. I honestly feel that the TCBS has ended. I feel a mere individual at present, with intense feelings more than ideas, but very powerless." Again, addressing intense feelings that he doesn't know how to cope with or to express. "Of course, the TCBS may have been all that we dreamt, and its work, in the end, be done by 3 or 2 or 1 survivor, and the part of the others be trusted by God. to that of the inspiration which we do know we all got and get from one another. To this I now pin my hopes and pray God that the people chosen to carry on the TCBS may be no fewer than we three. I do, however, dread and I grieve about it, apart from my own personal longings, because I cannot abandon yet the hope and ambitions that first became conscious at the Council of London. When they had secret meetings, they called it a council. They had a secret council in London. And he speaks and says, that council was, as you know, followed in my own case with finding a great voice for all kinds of pent-up things and a tremendous opening up of everything for me. I've always laid that to the credit of the inspiration that even a few hours with the Immortal Four always brought to all of us. There you are. I have sat solemnly down and I've tried to tell you dryly just what I think. I wish I could know where you are. I make a guess, of course. Write to me when you get a ghost of a chance. Yours, John Ronald. The accuracy of the film in bringing us this emotion shows me that the filmmakers actually did their research. The screenwriters did their research. But imagine a young orphan who has no family, no connections, and these young boys, these kids in his school, become the sounding board for every creative ounce that he had in his being. So without them, you wonder if he would ever been able to nurture those voices and that innate talent. I would ask your thoughts on this.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that I think writers, at least in the science fiction and fantasy field, I really can't speak for other types, do tend to form these groups. Did Emily leave? Is she still here somewhere?
She had an early morning
Okay.
tomorrow. She had to leave.
But there is an Albuquerque group called Critical Mass that gets together, read stories, and critique each stories, and she's a very active member of that. And Tolkien certainly felt the need for supporting people around him. I mean, we were talking about his later life, and this is going to be a sequel movie. There's not going to be a direct sequel by these filmmakers, but I understand there is an Inklings movie in development.
Ooh.
And of
Okay.
course, that was the, he had these Immortal Four, as he's calling it, several of whom died, and that was the end of that group. But later, in later life, he sought out another similar group with entirely different people, with C.S. Lewis and Charles Williams and other folks who met at the Eagle and Child.
The Bird and the Baby. Yes.
The Inklings, and they became a very large part of his later life and development. They were the first people to hear Lord of the Rings.
Well, I think it's fascinating to me to think about being in the company of people who see you and who hear you.
Mm.
And to me, I mean, the work that he did with the Inklings, the reading out, he and C.S. Lewis, the reading out of portions of their writing, the sharing and creating of community. I write creatively as well. I write short stories, but mostly my work is essays and academic stuff. But even in that kind of writing, my best writing comes out of the forge of my friendships with people. And it starts in conversation. It starts in exchange and camaraderie. And, I think human beings are not, except for when we're writing, solitary people. I mean, the stuff of much of what we do comes out of social interaction, and it's very natural. But then we have to go do the work by ourselves. But it's the communities that we form, I think, that are important. That's a pretty consistent idea or process.
Indeed. Mr. Martin? I'm curious how many...
There is a there's a wonderful romanticism to this film and to these early parts of Tolkien's life. His romance with Edith, which, we don't know what went on inside that marriage over the long years. I'm sure there were times they had fights and disagreements and all that, and we don't know that. But from the outside, the image, it's a tremendously romantic story, falling in love as young kids, and then he moves away from her. She gets engaged to someone else to get reunited. Beren and Luthien on their tombstones is tremendously romantic. And then the relationship with the Immortal Four. But we have to put it in context here, and I hate to sound too cynical about it, maybe because I myself was a very romantic, and maybe at a certain age you become a disillusioned romantic. But remember that these were adolescents. The Immortal Four, which is a kind of pretentious name to give themselves, were basically high school kids when they formed this bond, and then they went on to be college kids. And, there's part of me inside that's still 16 years old, but the outside is obviously not.
35.
And I remember these very intense feelings of, your first love, your first group of friends and all that. What happens in later life, though? And when you look at the Inklings and compare it to the Immortal Four here, you see friendships, but they're much more difficult friendships. It's not just we love each other and support each other. I mean, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien had a friendship, but it was a troubled friendship. It was a rivalry. They had rifts. First Lewis was an atheist, and Tolkien was trying to convince him to go to Catholicism. And then when Lewis did convert to Christianity, he went way beyond Tolkien and became like a fundamentalist Christian and not a Catholic, which pissed Tolkien off.
Yes.
And then Tolkien had very strong ideas about fantasy, which you can see, and Lewis starts writing the Narnia stuff, which basically Tolkien didn't think very much of at all, and he had to,
That it was on training wheels.
That's right. What the hell is this stuff with the
Fantasy on training wheels.
Yeah.
Can you imagine those guys sitting there saying, Jack, I hate allegory. Do you know that? I can't imagine.
And then Charles Williams joins the group, who's the other prominent member, and he's the quote of him that comes down to us through the ages is, when Tolkien was giving a reading from Lord of the Rings, says, "Oh God, not another fucking elf."
Yeah, exactly.
So, it makes you wonder, and I'm putting my own experience into this from friends I had and young writers when we were all starting out in the 20s. Life happens, and it's very difficult. Even if people are not killed in wars, it's very difficult to maintain that kind of close relationship and that lifelong love. It's a wonderful thing if you do, but some people have flourishing careers, other people fail, marriages break up, people have affairs, people are changed by their circumstances. It's interesting that the fourth member, Christopher, you don't hear much about him except he survived the war, but he wasn't friends with Tolkien anymore.
Stopped composing music.
Yeah.
No one had a term for post-traumatic stress disorder back then.
Shell shock.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
and the other thing about your point, George, about the romanticism of it, one can be romantic about someone if one is frozen in time.
Right.
And if 50% of this group dies young, is frozen in time, then nothing ruins that relationship.
Right.
There's no tainting of it. There's no, so you can, and in that you get to hold on to yourself, a part of yourself at 18 or 16 or 17.
It's the Jim Morrison phenomenon. I mean, Jim Morrison will always be handsome and sexy and dangerous because he died.
Though
Elvis got fat and paunchy and all of that. If Elvis had actually died around, when he went into the army in like 59,
Oh my God.
Elvis would be Jim Morrison. We remember this incredible rebel and who rewrote the whole music world.
that's why we refer to that moment when the plane went down as the night the music died, right? Because they died young and beautiful, and yeah, it's fascinating.
And
Well, Big Bopper wasn't especially beautiful, but still, he died.
Elvis did okay.
No.
Well,
Isn't he
I
still
think
alive?
that there is an American culture anyway, this idea that you can't live, you know, Dorothy Parker lived a long time and wrote a long time, but people were proclaiming her dead every 5 years for a long time. It's almost like in living, she somehow broke faith with those who wanted to be romantic about what it was to be one of the lost generation of the 1920s, because she continued to live beyond, you know, what was a romantic age, right?
Expiration date was.
Her expiration,
Yes,
right, this is how
yes.
we do it. And, you know, Jim Morrison will never come back and smoke the joints that people keep leaving on his grave in Paris. But,
Yeah.
but, you know, people do that. Even people who don't, you know, my students, I'm like, you're 22. What do you know about Jim Morrison, and why was it a pilgrimage for you to go leave a joint on his grave? You know? What is that about? And that's about a nostalgia and a romanticism. It's about sort
Yeah.
of untainted youth, and that's a part of, in my mind, the American psyche. We love that.
There's a line in the movie where you know, he says, "I wish you all happiness" to Edith, and then he retracts it. And, no, I don't wish you happiness. I wish you magic. You know, and that's the young Tolkien. That's the romanticism, and that's also me, I think, and it's also fantasy readers in general, and maybe fantasy writers. In all of us, there is a hunger for magic. Why does Lord of the Rings appeal to fantasy fans, generations of them, hundreds of thousands of people around the world? Not everybody likes it, of course. There's the other school, the naturalist, the realist school, that has disdain for magic. But I think in a substantially large portion of the human race, we hunger for magic. And you can't find it in real life. You find it in movies and television. And, you know, no matter, all of us have magical experiences in our life, and many of them frequently when we're young. But then real life sets in and we become disillusioned and so forth. You know, the most romantic relationship with a person of the opposite sex, and you get married and it's beautiful and it's wonderful, but a few years down the road you're going to be arguing about how to make the mortgage payments, and did you forget to take out the garbage, and you know,
Why is the cap still not on the toothpaste?
all of that stuff. Yes, it's
Why is that so hard?
That's so funny. That's so funny.
but there is, you know, I wrote an essay for I won't call it an essay. I wrote a couple paragraphs for a book of photographs of fantasy writers a few years ago, The Faces of Fantasy, where I talk about, you know, but in fantasy we're looking for the magic. We want to see the colors again. We want, you know, red meat and beautiful sunsets and a love that'll last forever somewhere south of Oz and north of Shangri-La, and you know, all of that stuff. And yet we're living in this world that really doesn't have magic. And I look at my own life, and I've been wanting magic like all my life. I was very young. I was a bright kid, and I think I was like 7 years old when I figured out there was no Santa Claus. I just couldn't make sense of this stuff that my parents were telling me, you know. How can I go to every place in the world on the same night? And how can they come down the chimney? We live in an apartment. We have no chimney. How did they get into our place? And everybody else there. It made no goddamn sense, you know. And I finally went to my parents at 7 and said, "It's not real, isn't it? This Santa Claus thing you've been selling. It's not real." And they said, "Oh, yes, you're right. You're a little young to figure it out, but okay. Don't tell your sisters. They still believe in them." But it was good. They approved of me not believing in Santa Claus. But then a year later, when I was like 8, I applied the same sort of rationality to Jesus. And they didn't like that. It was like, this Jesus stuff makes no sense either. Walking on the water, raising the dead people, no.
That's where I was going to go when you said we seek magic. And I think we, fantasy fiction writers, there is a hope. There is a hope and a desire to have faith beyond the power of what you concretely understand in your world to be true or real. And the desire to create that or see that as a possibility, to me, is very much also at the root of Christianity. And it's at the root of, it's
This reminds me of the conversation that C.S. Lewis had with John Ronald Tolkien as they took that famous walk along Magdalen College. And if you've ever been to Oxford, where I've been myself, it's famous for those Oxford walks. And to walk along Magdalen College, along, I think there's a path called Dead Man's Path.
it's a Deer Park.
It's Deer Park? Yeah, that's right. And they were talking about theology, the same way that we were just discussing it. And Tolkien said, here's the distinction I want to make clear to you, Mr. Lewis, Jack. What if this mythology that we're talking about is so powerful it affects the heart and affects the spirit and has staying power? And Mr. Lewis replied, well, yes, it's still just storytelling. It's just a mythology. And Tolkien replied, well, religion, I believe, is a mythology that is real. And he used that line to button that point and to convince, unsuccessfully, to get C.S. Lewis to, convert to Christianity. And he didn't become Catholic. He became way far beyond. So I find that fascinating, then, that the power of mythology sometimes jumps the line from mythology to active religion. We see it in your work. We see it in Tolkien's work. It's fascinating to me, don't you think?
Tolkien's religiosity, or his faith, as you want to call it, is an interesting subject. I've read a few reviews of this movie even before I saw it, and one of the criticisms of this movie is it doesn't pay enough attention to Tolkien's Catholicism.
That's the criticism I hear most. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
and because it was such a major fact in his life. But it is very curious to look at the world that he created in Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, and realize that there's no religion in it. There's no temples. There's no order of priesthood. There's no one going to Sunday services, or there's no 10 Commandments or any of that stuff. There are things that are close to living gods, like the wizards and so forth.
Valar, yes.
And you can certainly look at Sauron and Morgoth as devils of a sort, but there's no organized religion.
But there is a commitment to the preservation of innocence and hope and light, right? Particularly in the Lord of the Rings, right? The helping, the continuation of the quest is about seeing the innocent come to fruition in their goal, right? It's about the protection of something bigger and better than the darkness, the evil, right? So I think where it's not literal, he allows it to flourish in story. This idea of faith and hope and a greater good and a conscience of humanity that can recognize and support that, as one might say religion does in humankind.
Tolkien identified the creator as capital C, the creator, God, which would be Iluvatar in his mythology. And he also said, as a writer, I feel that it is a great experience to make testament to the divine by being sub-creators. We as human beings have the ability, intellectually, spiritually, to honor this creation that we have by creating extra creations within it, worlds within worlds, in a sense, which is another approach that I've always found fascinating.
Well, in my Baptist growing up, right? In my Baptist Methodist growing up, one of the things you'd always hear the elders in the church say is, the Spirit moves through you. It moves through, this is the Spirit that's moving through you. You were able to create this beautiful music because something is creating through you. And that, I think, is parallel to Tolkien's idea about how we as beings of creation create.
Indeed. Boy, this is a much heavier Q&A than Stephen Colbert got to do. We're getting into some deep, granular stuff. I love it. I love it. Now, before we even go to Ask the Audience Q&A, I really wanted to ask something maybe a little bit more surface. Out of all the great stories that Tolkien has given us, Unfinished Tales and The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, who is the character that you most identify with, that you really feel akin to? Anybody here? Because I remember you, George, saying something about Boromir the other day.
I don't know if I feel most akin to him, but Boromir to me is one of the greatest characters, because I'm always attracted to great characters. I find human beings, when I look around the world, the people I've known in my own life, they're flawed. We all have heroism in us, but we also all have selfishness in it. We look back at our lives, we have things we've done that we're proud of, with things we've done that we're ashamed of. So people who are always noble or people who are always evil seem a little transparent to me. Boromir is a wonderful mixture. He is a hero. I mean, he is a hero of his people. He's a valiant warrior. He's very courageous, but he succumbs to the ring. So he struggles with it, but he fails, and there's a great tragedy in it. In my mind, he's a tragic hero. He's up there like Macbeth or Julius Caesar in Shakespeare's plays, or Hamlet. These are the heroes of Shakespeare's tragedies. Noble men who have a tragic flaw and they succumb, and that is Boromir. And you could maybe make the same case about Saruman, but we never knew. Saruman may have started out being a good guy when he first arrived with Gandalf, but we never really see that side of Saruman. He's pretty evil from the first time we do it. With Boromir, we see the struggle on stage, and so he's a character who speaks powerfully to me. And of course, in Peter Jackson's movie, he's wonderfully portrayed by Sean Bean. And one of Sean Bean's numerous on-screen deaths is tremendously poignant at the end of Fellowship.
Bilbo
Yes.
is who I would say I identify with
Yes.
for a lot of reasons, but that's Bilbo Baggins.
Yes.
I will ask you to share the microphone, and I would like to say that I'm dramatically flawed before we start our next question. Do we have any questions in the audience?
So much more interesting.
The power of beginnings. The whole movie was very moving, but the moment that I actually cried out, started to cry, was when he wrote the opening lines of The Hobbit. It's sort of like with Churchill. This was the end of the beginning. It was the lead up to getting those words on paper. So what did you think of that moment of agency when finally all the stuff that was stirring around in his head and his life, where finally the ink was hitting the paper?
Well, I like you, I thought it was a poignant moment, and of course I knew that the legend that he was correcting papers, and on the back of an exam paper, he wrote the first line of the Hobbit. I do sometimes wonder, whose exam paper was it? And did he give it back to that kid?
Yeah, I've wondered that too.
What did the professor doodle there on the back of my paper when he gave me a D-? The one thing that the movie cheats at, though, is, if you just watch the movie, you'd almost think that that was the first story he ever committed to paper. I mean, you see him, before that, you see him drawing. You see all these cartoons of monsters and forests and things like that. but the truth is, you know, when did he write that? The Hobbit came out in 37. So maybe he wrote it in 36, 35. I don't know exactly when he wrote it, but around then. But the truth is, he'd been working on the Silmarillion since the trenches. And so there were lots of previous pieces of paper on which he was writing things, never finishing them, but he was working on the Silmarillion. But those are the kind of things you have to do when you're doing a motion picture. You're not doing a documentary, so.
Right. Right. He did actually read that first verse of the Lay of Eärendil, the mariner. He read that to his friends in the TCBS before he was sent to the front. And he said in the letters, it was received very well. And he was very happy that his friends were happy with the Eärendil poem that he had first come up with. Yeah. Yeah. The movie cheats at a few moments of chronology in time, shifting things here and there.
Because usually they kick people out of the theater at like 3 hours.
Yeah.
So I wanted to also, since we're talking about the movie, for me watching it, I think this movie takes some important and beautiful liberties with moments on screen. I pay attention to how films are cut and how little time is often spent on allowing a moment to unfold without commenting on it or forcing an audience member into a certain sort of emotional space. And I think that what the film gets really right is allowing a few beats for us to experience the actor's emotion evolving and for us to witness, right, the narrative significance of a moment between the characters on screen, which doesn't often happen in film lately.
In American film.
Not in American film, no. It's like, wow, I don't even know what, okay, oh, we're here already? Okay. And I think that they do that. It's something that British film cinema often does, but this film does really, really well.
Worth noting that it is Dome Korakowski's first English language film ever. In Finland, he is revered as like almost the Spielberg of Finland cinema. He has won so many awards, so many great films in Finland, and now we, the English-speaking audience, are learning of his filmmaking talent for the very first time, I believe.
And I think that the cast, this cast is mostly British.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that the acting, the casting is really important, and I think they made exceptional choices about who they placed in what roles.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the recognition, sometimes you place an actor in a role and the actor takes over the moment and you forget who you're supposed to be watching because you think, oh, that's Brad Pitt playing the guy who reformed the baseball team, and oh, he's doing really good at that. You would believe he's a baseball player. So the spaces between you and the moment that you're observing that, you know, is supposed to be on screen, and there's none of that for me watching this.
Yes.
Okay, I was just wondering, of the three great tales, The Children of Hurin, The Baron and Luthien, and The Fall of Gondolin, which is each of your favorites?
Okay, anything that has to do with Baron and Luthien, I'm a huge sucker for. Werewolves, vampires, the power of music. Now, the power of music, so essential to the Silmarillion and all of Tolkien's mythology, really put in a specific place of action in that narrative. The power of her song and her music. I'm all about that. Yeah, that's me. All about Baron and
We have
Luthien.
another question.
There.
First of all, I have to say this was a wonderful event. I'm so glad everyone put this on. It was a fantastic movie. I wanted to amplify something you said about how there's no religion in Tolkien's Middle Earth. There's no liturgies and no services. This isn't my analysis. I'm struggling to remember where I read this, but somebody pointed out that there's no afterlife in Tolkien. There's no legends, there's no concept of an afterlife. So this is a very strong motivating factor. There's no second chances. Elves are immortal, but when they're killed, they're done. They don't come back. Gandalf comes back from the dead, but it happens off screen. You know, it's not a cultural fixture that people come back from the dead. So it really motivates the characters. You have one life, you have to live it now, and that's all you get. Thought that was a very interesting observation.
Well, what about going into the West?
Yes, but the people who do that are still alive.
Well, but then they live forever in the West.
Well, sure, but that's different from an afterlife. They're immortal, but if they're killed before they get there, that's too bad for them. The example in the analysis I read was that Aragorn and Arwen are not going to meet in Valinor or anywhere else. Once Aragorn's gone, he's just gone. Their romance ends there.
Tolkien presented,
What about, I mean,
the Doom of Men, as a different thing. Yeah.
there is a gorgeous speech by Gandalf in Return of the King, where Minas Tirith is about to fall, and he tells
Pippin.
is it Pippin? Yes, that and there will be a bright green land and a sudden sunset. Is that entirely from the movie, or is that not in Tolkien?
It was,
He says it earlier in the books.
yeah.
Yeah, it was not said to Pippin. It was said earlier in the books by Gandalf.
Okay,
But yeah, he
but it
says
implies an afterlife.
it does. It does. But you see, the elves and mortal men had this crushing conflict of spiritual ideology, because men were given a different eternity, a different life after their first mortal life that was kept as a mystery. The elves did not understand it. The elves did not understand or appreciate that their god, Iluvatar, had given them immortality, such as it was in one lifetime, but no future lifetimes beyond the veil of the unseen. Mortal men were given that, and it was a secret that, well, the elves actually held on as some kind of theological resentment over centuries. It's built into the deeper weavings of the story. It's really interesting, really. To me, anyways.
Well, wouldn't that also go to play in because of his Catholic upbringing? The war between heaven and hell was like the creation of the realms of Middle Earth and the different ages of the light. As there were many wars in heaven and hell, and many angels that did participate, like Galadriel, she did participate in the Kingslaying and had all that happen, but men were being granted that gift, much like the angels resented men, and they don't have, genitalia or anything else, so angels are very resentful.
There you go. And a lot of other fantasists have explored that. Neil Gaiman, most successfully, has explored some of that conversation in the Sandman mythology. Yes.
I can see the cherubs being especially pissed. They have to stay as fat little babies with wings for centuries at a time. Okay, question in the back there.
Hi, thank you so much. So the film really takes a lot of time, I think, focusing on his relationship with his mother early on in the film, which I really appreciated, and obviously his relationship with Edith. There's been a lot said over the years about the representation and development of women in Tolkien's work. How do you feel that potentially his, relationships with his mother early on and with Edith over his lifetime influenced that throughout his work?
I was very pleased to see Mabel Tolkien and Edith Tolkien represented as such very, very profound influences on him. And yet we see a world dominated by men, and a masculine society in Middle-earth. And here comes Éowyn, here comes Galadriel, here comes Luthien, Arwen, women characters who, often pushed to the background, suddenly shine much, much stronger, with much more potency, power, physical power, spiritual power. These women are in it to win it in Middle-earth, and they're drawn exceptionally well by Tolkien. And I guarantee you it's because of the memory of his mother and Edith, certainly. After she died, he also died very, very soon after her from, the doctor said it was a stomach ulcer, but I know it was a broken heart. He just couldn't live without her,
I think that when we go to that place and we think about the most profound relationships that we can have, our parental relationships right, are the root of, and the blueprint or the template for every other relationship we have. And in Tolkien's story, and also in this C.S. Lewis's story, there's this, the profound shaping of their lives by the loss of their mothers. And I don't think they're unique in that. I mean, I think, when we lose our mother figures, and people have been doing, it's like every Mother's Day is this Sunday, but every few years someone does a documentary, about somebody who, loses their mother and what that means. Artists translate that, I would argue, in meaningful ways in their work, and it's not distinct. What's wonderful about Tolkien's work is that, again, and this is the romantic element, the power, the spiritual, the creative potency that these women have is made immortal in the literature. And it's allowed to have the impact that it obviously has on all of us, right, through the ages. It's to me very simple. It's not, I don't want to talk about Freud and all that crap,
true,
right? But it's very simple to me.
We also have to keep in context that Tolkien was a man of his time. I mean, he was born in the 19th century and lived in the early part of his formative years were before World War I. And there was a time where women's roles in society were far more restricted. I mean, you notice when Edith is obviously a very intelligent and very talented woman, but you don't see her going to Oxford and joining him and his friends there, or Cambridge, or any of that thing. The educational opportunities and the career opportunities for women were not there. And certainly that was true of the medieval period, which Tolkien was the medieval period, the Dark Ages, mythology. There are certainly great women in mythology, Guinevere, Morgan Le Fay, both good and evil, but there are only a few of them. And that's what Tolkien did. I think he's given us Galadriel, who's an amazing figure. He's giving us Eowyn, who is one of my favorites and has one of the great box office moments in the trilogy and in the movie when she rips off the helmet and says, "No man am I, you son of a bitch."
Yeah.
So eat this. Arwen is really hardly there. I mean, she's much bigger in the movies because they gave her Glorfingel's.
Yeah, she replaced
big
Glorfindel.
roles.
Yep.
So she has a lot more there, but she's mentioned there. She's there, but she's not as major. And Tolkien did entirely forget to provide females in a number of his races. The Entwives have vanished. The Ents don't know where they mislaid them somewhere, but they're all gone. And of course, the dwarves may have females, but if so, they have beards. You can't tell them from the men. We don't know where the dwarf women are. The orcs certainly seem to be reproduced from mud. There are no, as I said on Stephen Colbert's show, there are no orchettes. So he has entire races here that don't seem to have a female side at all, or at least none that we ever see. We only see the elf women and the human women.
Can I? I'd also like to speak, your point, George, about, he was a man of his time. One of the things that I think is also important is that we, the domestic sphere was the even for at that time what would have been progressive men, the limit of the imagination to believe that women had the capacity to do something besides be mothers and good wives. I think what this film offers us by way of a critique of that is her saying to him directly in the narrative of this film this is it for me.
Yep.
I don't get to go to do critiques at a sisterhood somewhere, right? I am poor, and this is where we are. The class system in England is fully in place. I don't have any avenues for my creative brilliance.
Mm-hmm.
You know what my brilliance is because I sat here at tea and corrected, a basic premise of how you approach language, right? That you then found a dawn to reinforce, right? So I think that that was reality for women. And even if he recognized the gifts that his wife had and wanted to pay homage to that in his work, that was still a very myopic view of the possibilities of women.
I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Yes, we do.
I'd be curious to know if there are any other fantasy writers on the panel, what your experience was with Tolkien and how you would talk about if he inspired you, or not inspired, but if you have any reference or how it might have influenced or not influenced your work.
Yeah, and anyone who writes epic fantasy, or high fantasy as it's sometimes called, is working in Tolkien's shadow. Certainly, if you look at the history of fantasy, it's a form of literature. I won't call it a genre because I think it's bigger than that. It's a form of literature that has very deep roots. It goes back always to the ancient Greeks and medieval period and so forth. But Tolkien redefined it. He changed it for all time. You look at the work of even brilliant writers like Lord Dunsany or Robert E. Howard, very different from each other, but Tolkien, you can't write a Dunsanian kind of thing anymore. People expect a Tolkien sort of thing, and there are fantasy writers out there who don't like Tolkien's work and disparage him at every opportunity, but if you read their work, they're still working in Tolkien's shadow. They're very self-consciously saying, I'm not going to do what Tolkien did, and you can see his influence on them. Every modern fantasy writer, certainly including me, is hugely influenced by Tolkien. He redefined the form. And there are a lot of ways he did that. I mean, I could talk for an hour about this, but we don't have the time. But one of the major things is the world building. When we think of Tolkien, we think of Middle-earth. When Tolkien achieved his first great success, he had published in England, The Hobbit was a modest success, Lord of the Rings came out in the 50s, it was a modest success, only in hardcover. It wasn't until the American paperback came out and suddenly caught on all across the United States with college students largely. And it was my generation of people, Frodo Lives buttons and posters in all of half the college rooms in America. What was on that poster? Well, it wasn't a movie poster because there were no movies yet. It wasn't the cover of the book. It wasn't a artistic portrayal of any of the characters that would be later seen on the calendars. The poster that took America by storm was a map of Middle-earth. A map, because this world was so real to people. And Middle-earth had a sense of reality to it that no previous fantasy work had ever done. And ever since then, fantasy writers have been trying to do the same thing. It's certainly what I've tried to do with Westeros, to make it as real, as grounded, and as rich a world as Tolkien did with Middle-earth.
Do we have one more question? Maybe two.
Do you think this format would have changed or would have been possible without World War I? I mean, I think this was as a history teacher, I think that this was the first, as it was the World War, this is the first thing that put the globe or the world on a map for us as humans, as a society. And then this is when the format changed. Do you think that this would have been a possibility without that event? And for him to experience it firsthand and to see suffered through such loss all together at one go. Do you think his work would have been the same without it?
I think World War One. We talk about it in terms of trauma and loss, but also World War One was the it was the fruition of modern industrial warfare, and it wasn't the U.S. was further removed from World War One, but we weren't entirely removed, and a generation was lost in England. If your work, for me, if your world is falling apart, to think about the possibility of creating a world that either echoes your emotions or provides an opportunity to reimagine the world makes perfect sense to me. That makes perfect sense to me. There's no way to know, right, if World War One wouldn't have happened if Tolkien would have been able to produce what he produced. But for me, if World War One had some value, the creative expression of his experience in World War One might have made it more tolerable to think about the global loss of World War One, and those are the terms that I think about it.
We have time for one last question.
I would also like to add, for those folks who haven't seen it yet, get your hands on Peter Jackson's unbelievably, beautifully restored documentary, They Shall Not Grow Old. Have you seen it?
Yes.
Yes. Now, if you haven't yet, that is going to give you some insights into World War One, because they restored the imagery. They took archival film that was rotted away and falling apart, and he restored it and then made it color, and then got actual World War One tanks and guns out into the field and fired them, and had his technical team record all the sounds of the cannons.
And he had lip readers.
And he had lip readers
from the same areas of each of those.
Yes, and the story is told just from the lost generation of those men, from collected interviews when they were much older, and it's visceral. It's really amazing. It's worth seeing.
On iTunes.
Yes.
So, my question, you mentioned how J.R.R. Tolkien talked about how religion is a mythology that is real. Do you think that was implemented on Frodo at all? Because there's all of these characters that sit around and they're like, what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? And then they make this fellowship about, we're focusing on you, we're protecting you, we're making you like the center like the big picture here.
You mean a savior figure?
Yeah. And it's reflected again towards the end of the series where they're about to charge in, and Aragorn turns around and says, let's do this for Frodo. And I just wanted to know how you guys felt about that idea right there.
I think Frodo's a fascinating character. And to my mind, this is one of the great things about Tolkien that makes him so much more than C.S. Lewis. Aslan is Jesus. He's Jesus with a mane and a tail, but he is Jesus. But Frodo may be a savior figure, but he's not Jesus. He doesn't have any magical superpowers. If he was killed, he wouldn't come back from the dead like Aslan and Jesus. He can't walk on water or raise the dead or anything. He's like one of the weakest and humblest characters in the whole thing. And even more strikingly, in the end, he fails. He succumbs. He's heroic, and he gets almost there. But at the end, he says, "No, the ring is mine. Fuck you all." That's the genius of Tolkien, to do it that way, to do the things he did. And you look at the Tolkien imitators who followed; none of them have had the courage to do that. Frodo analogs win in the end and succeed. That and you know, when I first read the books at 13, I also didn't understand the scouring in the Shire. Wait a minute, they threw the ring in, but the story should be over. What is this? Everything is crappy now. Wait a minute. But that was, again, the genius of Tolkien. Now I read it and I see what he's doing there. It's amazing.
And if you want to think about it in terms of allegory, I mean, he's driving home this point about free will. Right? People can sacrifice themselves for you, but ultimately, I mean, as a parent, you know, I'm always tempted to say, do you know what sacrifices I made for you? To my daughter, right? And then, you know, she can decide to do it, you know, ultimately, whatever she wants to do with her life, it's her life. Right? And if she's overcome by greed or avarice or desire or whatever, and that runs counter to what my intentions for her were, for the greater good of my family, I want you to do this. That doesn't, you know, oh well. The price of parenting.
Indeed, indeed. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I would like to continue much, much later into the evening. Wouldn't you all? Wouldn't we all? Now, I want to just say something else before we wrap this all up. Thank you, Thomas Newman, for that score. Okay, that score in that film. What? And like, thank you. Just want to say thank you, Thomas Newman, wherever you are. And yeah, it's really beautiful.
It's a gorgeous film altogether.
Don't you think? Don't you think? And I don't understand why some of the critics, believe it or not, the East Coast literati have been after Tolkien since the 1950s. They're just ruthless. And right now, anything related to Tolkien, they're after him. And in the New Yorker, the guy, I think he said, this movie verges on obnoxiousness. He literally said, and I'm like, you didn't even see the same movie that we saw. Did you? This guy's crazy.
That's the elf calling the elf an elf?
Yeah. Wow, yeah. Yeah, I think it was in the New Yorker or Time Out New York, whatever. To hell with those people. I think there's a sincerity and an earnestness that's going on here. And believe it or not, Domey Korkowski he had the lights turned on in his tree at 12 years old. He was just a boy. He was unfamiliar with this English author, but when he read The Hobbit, it was all Finnish names. Kili and Fili and all these Finnish names for dwarves. And the director wanted to bring that creative inspiration full circle, I believe, with this film. And I think he succeeded. I really do.
Yeah, as do I.
Yeah.
So thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you all very much.
And thank you to our wonderful costume people as well. That really made the
You all
made
look
the evening.
fabulous.
And I have to say thank you for the generosity. Santa Fe never ever spent any time. Everyone here has been so lovely. Santa Fe, you've charmed me, and it's just lovely to be here. It's lovely. I'm very lucky to be here. Thank you all.
Good night, all.
Figure out where everything
The knee, with Roddy. Yeah. Oh, wow.
So when you get your
guys will help me, right? Nobody here knows Into the West at all, right? No. Anybody know that? Night has fallen. What come night to sleep is now. Say the world you left behind. What can you see on the horizon? Why do the white ghosts call across the sea? Up in the rises, they are calling. You and I will
Oh, yeah. Well, it's all new. You know, it's supposed to be a start. I think we're changing that. Okay. Yep. I made a living doing other things. I mean, we're waiting on the third judge.
What are these tears upon your face? Soon you will see.
So guess who's going to be coming in round 5?
You're doing the front. Crying is that was the song that we had at the wedding. My wife and I, that was yeah. It's a beautiful, beautiful song. Are we almost there? We're ready. That's the sign of readiness. Okay. Yes. We've grown so much.
Well, if we're going to keep doing events like this, having you, we'll definitely have to expand based on.
We're going to line everybody up.
And continue to grow.
You know, usually when I do cosplay, it's as Sandor Clegane the Hound. So I can do the mountain as well if need be.
I know I'll say Materian, I guess.
Yes.
Thank you. So we're starting here probably in about maybe 1 minute. Please bear with me. Thank you.
1 minute. No. I mean,
You guys just need to listen for your number, and when you're all done.
Commentary from me? No.
Right up here. Come up on stage. You deserve to be on stage.
Yeah, you have to. You make it? Give it up! Beautiful! Wow! Look at that!
Tell us who you are.
Yes, tell us a little bit about the costume and the character, so that our judges can. Okay.
You know, hi, Gabrielle.
Ooh. The most powerful elf as far as I know.
I was born in the age under the light of the 2 trees, before the Arda and before the Varda, before the Kingslayer age, and when I rebelled, I was not allowed into the Valaria. But I have been welcomed back, and right now I need to help Frodo and his quest. And I'm still trying to get you, Miss Danbury, to take over the White Council.
I'd love to, but that's Saruman. He just likes to keep his hold on things.
Well, that may cause him trouble down the line at some point.
We shall see.
Any questions for the Lady of Water?
I think we have. Any questions? If not, can we move to the next?
Thank you so much.
tell us about your character and your costume?
I'm Arwen, the true love of Aragorn, King Elisar, Estelle, and that's it.
That's perfect. Turn around, show off the workstation. The light, you can see it's very, very beautiful. Very elven.
Thank you so much. Please mind your step on the way out. Number 3, if you will.
This is an elf who gets the job done.
Please tell us who you are.
I am the Lady Miriam of the Glad Hill. I am the witch of Rosenwood. My bow is inscribed with the dwarf runes of old. I call it the 6th stone of the golden runes.
And what ring do you have on that finger? It looks very beautiful. I don't mean to put you on the spot. I just want everyone to see the beautiful jewelry and the beautiful costume. Let's, yes? Hand done. Look at how beautiful they are.
And the runes on the bow are correct. I've read them. They are correct. Yes. Let you know.
Well done. I like Fancy Nancy so much. Well, again, give it up.
And Gandalf, for this next contestant, looks like I may need a little support here. Number 4, please make your way
Spawn
down.
of Morgoth? No. Clearly one of the 9 fallen men.
Please do
so
enlighten us.
Oh, fool, this is my hour. Have you not heard the prophecy?
I've heard it, but I suspect there may be somebody who might give you a surprise down the line. I don't know if it's a man, but...
This costume is 35 years old. I made it when I was back in college. People who are sufficiently ancient may remember the old Rankin Bass cartoon in this
Of
town.
course!
Yes!
Of course!
Yes!
Where there's a whip, there's a way.
35 years ago, that was all we had besides the books.
No, and I loved it. The Rankin Bass. I mean, the Hobbit.
Let's put them together one more time, please.
Fantastic.
Number 5, if you will, please join us.
Join us.
Oh, must be. Yes, the Witch King. Oh. That was a dark one.
I'm the Witch King of Angmar.
You are.
No judges.
Well, I would say you shall not pass, but I believe you've been studying very hard.
Yeah, I made the costume by myself. It took 1 month.
Beautiful. Nicely done. Everybody.
Thank you.
One of our judges.
So did you make the helmet as well?
No.
He shall not pass. Thank you so much. Thank you. Number 6, please. Entree.
I love that you're the fair people.
Yes, you can.
Fairly balanced, that is.
It goes with my outfit. I'll hold it.
So tell us a little bit about who you are and about this dress that you're wearing.
Okay.
Beautiful dress. And those ears.
I
I'm Galadriel. I am the fairest and mightiest of the elves remain in the Middle Earth. And I believe that even the smallest person can change the course of the future.
Oh, absolutely.
I have dyed my hair because nowadays it's fashionable.
Galadriel was always fashionable. Well done. Everybody?
Next we have number 7. It's a good number, by the way.
This is oh my, let's see. Who are you?
I'm Diana Warren. Can you hear me?
I can.
And I am an elf suffragette.
I love it.
Little known fact that the elves were very involved in the suffragette movement, especially in England and Ireland. Yes, and during Tolkien's time. We really believe in votes for humans and women, except just not the Midwest, you guys
Also resemble Edith Pratt. Tolkien.
Yes.
Yes.
Kind of the idea is kind of a mashup.
I like the mash, absolutely. Everybody give her a hand. Look at her.
Number 8 is great. Come on down.
All right.
Wow. I do, I bow.
Her Dark Majesty. There's no question.
I am Nancy Fay. Great-great-great-great-great-grandmother's daughter.
Ah!
You are all welcome.
Show us, turn to a twist around. Show us. Magical. Clearly magical.
I am non-genetically biased.
Number 9. Number 9.
Oh yeah.
I'm naked under here. I am Enelier, the wife of Enel, which was the third elf to be woken from the sleep of Yavanna, which is in the Silmarillion, which was published after, he died by his son. But no one knows what they look like. They look like this, and they never wore clothes. So now you know.
So a cloak is not clothes?
No. I did that for you all. You don't want to see
Oh,
it.
I understand. This was sort of an aid for us all.
Yeah.
So the costume really is just skin.
Do you really want to see? It's the truth. No, keep it G. What? Oh, nothing.
You can just sort of turn around if you like.
Oh, it's this.
Oh, there you go. Elf bum.
That's a hard one to follow. Number 10, please.
That's a toughie.
Order up! Tap to see no one! And we need to have a seal faces out of the sky!
Is it Barnum?
It is Dinosaur Butterbird!
Dinosaur Butterbird Barnum.
Yes, it's a stretch, but yet we are here.
Is that you doing? Are you at the Prancing Tyrannosaurus Rex?
Prancing Parasaurolophus! With a few Pregosauruses here and there.
As long as you do a good brew, I'm okay.
We have a mug of tail here. And a real life, or model of a dragon anyway.
But does it come in pints?
Every epic or so, yes.
There's a tooth I have to talk to.
So, the costume has dinosaurs here. There are dinosaurs on the socks. This is a thrift store ale purchase here, so we spared much expense. So.
It's the fun.
Thank you. I'm going to ask all our contestants to just all walk through here and walk up on stage, and let's give our audience and our judges one more opportunity to behold.
Look at them.
Thank you guys so much. You all look amazing.
I don't do guitars. I don't work this. I almost do.
Granddaughter. Family photos here.
Please join us on stage. Please put your hands together for these folks.
This is fantastic. This was the last of the week, everybody. That is fantastic that this came together. We should all be proud.
Thank you so much. If you guys want to leave through this exit door, we'll give our judges just a few minutes to tally up their scores and come up with some winners. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, the real wizard has just appeared.
Ladies and gentlemen, George Martin.
Thank you, judges. Our judges are weighing, adding again, making a difficult decision. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and all of you who came in costume here. We have a few people who, for various obscure reasons, were not eligible to enter the contest, but nonetheless, come on up. Another elf, Marisa here. Come up. Come up. Marisa was a former employee, so therefore she gets disqualified. She's very elfish.
There we go. That was me.
Are you a particular elf?
No, I'm the elf.
Okay, very good. And we have a pair of hobbits.
Tell us who you are.
Come. Don't make a hobbit of being late. Very nice.
He's on stage. Just go in so you can listen. Just keep going in.
I think he's down playing with.
Sit down on the stairs.
Gollum, you're Gollum?
I'm Bilbo. I found this thing, though. Which I'm going to give to Frodo later.
That's probably good.
If I find him.
Don't give it to that Saruman guy. So we have prizes for the first 5 in the judges' competition, but for everyone who came in costume, we do have little tokens of...
Tokens?
Tolkien! Of coin purses. So we have totals yet.
We're getting close. We're getting close.
Okay.
Magic is hard work.
Give me the file again now. So, our 5th place winner, we have a couple of signed books here. We have Mystic, a fantasy novel by Jason Denzel, and we have Vacation Land by John Hodgman, both autographed. John Hodgman's Vacation Land is his account of his travels in the mystic realms of Maine and western Massachusetts. His adventures with raccoon feces, water that's so freezing that it'll paralyze you if you jump in it. The beach is made of sharp rocks. Maine is pretty much Mordor. So, who is the 5th place winner? Contestant number 6, Galadriel. You are. Thank you. Very cool.
Do you want to stay on stage, please? Yeah, please stay on stage.
Okay, the next,
Gonna lose my head here.
so for the 4th place winner, we have more books. We have The Wheel of Time Companion, about the world of Robert Jordan and his Wheel of Time books, signed by the 3 authors, Harriet McDougall, who's his widow, Alan Romanichuk, and Maria Simpkins. And we have The Skybound Sea by Sam Sykes, another epic fantasy novel. Sam is frequently seen here at the Jean Cocteau. He's the son of Diana Gabaldon, one of our favorite people. And Vacation Land by John Hodgman. And that goes to contestant number 5, The Witch King Angmar. There you are, witchy witchy. Okay, now for the 3rd place, we have The Wheel of Time Companion, as previously described, signed by the 3 people. Why don't you take the book? It's heavy. Vacation Land by John Hodgman. Mongrels, a Native American werewolf novel by Stephen Graham Jones. And this is very special. This is Tolkien and the Great War, The Threshold of Middle-earth by John Garth. But what's special about this thing, it was donated by the director of the film you are about to see. And he has inscribed it. This book was one of the most important source materials. The film didn't focus on. Well, he's inscribed it here in Emotional Journey of a Man, a Genius Grinding Through a Journey of Hardship and Darkness, signed by the director of the film. And this pile here goes to contestant number 4, the Lord of the Nazgul. Thank you, thank you.
Do Nazgul really read?
2nd place.
Oh my God.
2nd place, another pile of books. Once again, we have Mongrels, the werewolf novel. We have John Hodgman, Vacation Land.
Amazing.
We have The Wheel of Time Companion, once again. And we have a Realms, a role-playing game, art of Tony D. Terralisi. I never know about that. D. Terralisi, yes. Anyway, all those are signed. And we also have another book, Beren and Luthien by Tolkien.
Oh, yeah.
This is also signed by the director of the film, by Dom. This book is inspired by the one who danced among the trees. And there's a quote from a Tolkien poem here. And this goes to contestant number 3, Mellorian. Brings us to the first prize. And the first prize gets no books. Well, if you folks could stand aside here, further aside, further aside. This is a donation. Gandalf, perhaps you would like to tell us about this donation.
So Legionnaire has a very close relationship with the Chinese theater in Hollywood. The Chinese theater is owned by TCL Electronics, and they heard that we were going to be coming here, and they thought it would be a wonderful idea to give us a Palantir of sorts.
Whoa! Yeah!
65-inch HDR television with Roku. It is really...
4K.
Wait, we have a last minute entry.
Sorry, Strider. We're gonna have to do better than that. But yes,
And the television set goes to contestant number 1, Galadriel.
Well done. You know what you need to watch on that?
I hope you have a large card.
Cube, it's a washing machine on wheels. Oh my gosh, my car is not going to fit that. It's a Cube, it's a Nissan Cube, I love it, but it's named Gatsby because it believes in the green light. But I'm going to have to weave some magic. And, I have to use my ring with a dartboard around. That's not a good idea. Thank you all so much.
Please enjoy it.
We have these coin purses here for all of the people in costume, and you can keep your shekels and your groats and your golden dragons and anything like that for in those. And thank you for
well done, everybody.
And thank you to our distinguished panel of judges for judging.
Wait, who are they? Could you name them? Could they name themselves?
Elias, introduce our judges.
Here we are, please.
So I'm Emily Ma, also known as Ian Tippett.
Yeah. Wait. Tell us a sentence.
I am a writer. I used to drive George to writers group.
All right.
I'm Andrea Mays. I actually am a scholar in early 20th century American studies, and I am a lecturer at UNM.
Thank you for having me. Beautiful costumes. I'm Liz Pecos. I'm the president of IATSE Local 480, the Film Technicians Union of New Mexico, but my craft is costume.
Yeah!
I'm coaching, design, and supervising, and you all look amazing.
So this is totally
Thank you for
legit.
having me. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Now we'll enjoy a movie.
You got that, Nick.
Thank you, everybody. We will just deal with this television set, and we'll begin here shortly.